Let's begin with an overview of Azure Active Directory. Azure AD is a multi-tenant directory, so all customers or tenants are in one huge directory that Microsoft manages. However, your tenant is private to you. Azure AD is primarily an identity management directory, so it's mostly used for user login authentication. User IDs and passwords are validated against information that Azure AD stores, and then users can be given permissions to resources. Azure AD is a trusted provider, so that means it speaks the modern internet security protocols like OpenID, OAuth, and SAML, and this helps simplify single sign-on for cloud-based applications. Many companies will synchronize their on-prem Active Directory, ADDS, into Azure AD, and that process helps you leverage all the user accounts you already have in an on-prem environment. Before you add users to Azure AD, it's a great idea to first set up your custom domains. So a custom domain is any domain that you own that you want user ID suffixes to end in. So you must prove that you own the domain by going to the DNS zone for that domain and adding an entry. Let me show you what that process looks like in the portal. So here I am in my Azure Active Directory. If I scroll down on the left to custom domain names, you can see that I have one domain by default. This is the one that was created when my tenant was set up. So default tenants always end in onmicrosoft.com. I'm going to add a custom domain. And if I own the domain acmeparts.com, I can add that here. I must then go to the DNS zone for acmeparts.com and add this TXT record that's listed right here. Once I do that, I can click Verify here, and Azure AD will let me use that domain. Obviously, I don't know that domain, so that didn't work, but I can go back to look at my custom domains, and you can see that this is waiting to be verified. So it's an important step to do this, and I'll show you what I did in my own private domain. So I own buckscreek.com. When I verified that domain in my Azure AD tenant, I am then allowed to use that as a suffix for usernames that I create in Azure AD. So it's important to set up custom domains before you begin adding users in. Let's talk about the process of adding user accounts in Azure AD. So there's actually two types. One is called strictly a user account. That's typically for employees. These are people that will have a domain suffix from one of your custom domains. So the user ID will likely match something they already have on-prem and that they know as their logon ID. A guest account can be used for non-employees that need permissions in your directory. They can have any email address you want. They're actually sent an email invitation. You can then assign them to any security role, and they have those permissions in your directory. Let me show you how to set up a user account. So in my Azure Active Directory, I can go to Users, add a new user. So Create User allows me to type a username. Notice my domain suffix, the only one allowed, is the only one that's been verified for my domain. The only other required field here is a name. By default, Azure AD generates a password. You probably want to note this password somewhere because you can't see it later. You could just pass this information on to the user. And now Sue Blue is a user in my Azure Active Directory. Sue doesn't have any other permissions yet, but she's a user in my account, in my Azure AD, and I can come and assign roles to her, put her in groups, and so forth. To add a guest, it's the same process. You just click on the users, the Add a Guest link under Users, and then type in the information, including an email address, and that person will be sent an invitation to log on or accept the invitation to be a member of Azure AD. Next, let's talk about groups. So groups, just like in Windows, are ways that you can organize users by department, job title, whatever the groupings are that you need. And then you can leverage that when you start assigning permissions, because you can assign permissions for groups instead of users. When you set up a group, there are two types to know about. There are security groups and Microsoft 365 groups. Typically for Azure AD, you're going to be using security groups because those are the ones that you can use to assign roles and permissions. Microsoft 365 groups are used for features in Microsoft 365, like SharePoint collections, shared mailboxes and calendars, and so forth. So let's look at the process for setting up a group. Back in the portal, list groups. I have one group here called sales. I'll add a new group. It's a security group, the name of the group, research, add a description if you like. Membership type, we're going to do assigned first. So an assigned group means you're going to select members. And if you wanted Sue to be in that group, find Sue and select. Now all groups have an owner as well. By default, it's the person who creates the group, but the owner is the person who can change the membership of the group. I'll create the group. And now I have a new group. Let's refresh. And hasn't shown up in my list yet. There it is. Now, before we conclude our discussion of groups, let's also talk about dynamic groups. So the assigned group is the one I showed you. An assigned group is one where you specifically add users and other groups, possibly, to group membership. A dynamic group allows the membership to change dynamically. There's two types, dynamic user and dynamic device. We'll talk first about dynamic user. So it does require a paid tier of Azure Active Directory called Premium P1. Membership can automatically be assigned based on some attributes in the user object, such as department. There's a department attribute, and if you set the department, you could have a dynamically assigned group that was based on that department name. You could do the same for devices. We'll talk about devices later in this lesson. The nice thing about dynamic groups is if the attributes change for the user object, the group membership automatically changes. So if you move a user to a different department or give them a different job title, then their group memberships would change automatically. That makes it much easier to manage. I'll show you the rules engine in a moment for this, but you can construct rules that look at more than one attribute. In fact, up to 5 different attributes for determining group membership. So let's see how it is that we do that to set up a dynamic user group in Azure AD. I'll switch back to the portal. I'm going to do a new group, still a security group. I'll call this my R&D group, and I want the membership to be dynamic user. So I need to add a dynamic query. For dynamic query, you can choose, since it's a user, you choose properties from the user object, such as department. And you could say contains, maybe the word research. You could add another expression. And maybe the department for some of our people contains the value R&D. I would want to switch this to an or, so that the query effectively means if the user department contains the word research or contains R&D, then this user should be in the new dynamic group that I'm creating. I'll click Save here. There's my dynamic query representation. There's the name of my Azure AD group. And now I can create the group. So I've showed you the process for adding users and groups manually in Azure AD. If you're going to synchronize with your on-prem AD, then you would not add these in this way. You would set up your custom domains, but then you would import the user accounts and groups from your on-prem AD. Let me click refresh here and see if my group, there's my new dynamic security group.